In light of the recent underperformance of Australian equities, we're going to have a closer look at perhaps some of the key drivers of that. In this chart in front of us now, we're looking post 2015, the performance of the global market in red, in net local terms, and the performance of the ASX 200, the blue line. So basically tracked each other up until the end of April. So you can see the divergence over the past 5 months. If we sort of hone in on that area a little bit more closely to try to get an idea of the extent of the underperformance, you see that the global markets are up about 5.5% in that period, where the domestic market is down about 2%. So approximately a 7.5% underperformance in the space of 5 months. So what has been behind this period of underperformance? Well, we might first look at earnings growth. So these are consensus earnings, 12-month forward earnings growth for both global and Australian equities. Global indexes in red, and you can see at the start of the year, it was around about 12.5%, has since declined to something like 10.5% forward EPS growth. In the case of Australia, it's starting at about 12%. That's fallen away much more sharply to around about 4.5%. So what does that relationship look like over the longer term? So it's a slightly different one we're looking at here, but it's basically Australian equities relative to global equities on the left-hand scale, the blue line. You can see Australian equities underperforming by about 10% over the past 12 months. Now the red line is the relative earnings revision ratio. So in the case, so clearly when it declines, it should be associated with underperformance of Australian equities, and that has generally been the case. It's a much more volatile series, as you can see. But and so while earnings revisions have been worse for Australia than they have been for global markets, they probably don't explain the full extent of the underperformance. So perhaps we should look at the bank sector if we're going to understand where this underperformance has come from. Bank sector, obviously 28% of the domestic market here, so any underperformance of that is going to have significant impact on the domestic market more generally. So in this chart, we can see the blue line is global banks, and we're looking at their performance since the beginning of this year. So global banks are up in price terms around about 13-14%. The domestic bank sector is down by about 3%. That's the red line. So there's a fairly significant 15-16% underperformance on 28% of your index. That's a major headwind that the domestic equity market has had to contend with. A lot of that outperformance by global banks has been driven by the very, very strong performance of European ex-UK banks, which are up close to 30% on earnings recovery, relatively cheap valuations to begin with, and steepening yield curves. US banks, the green line, are up around about 5%, so not as strong, but still a reasonable performance. While Canadian banks are basically flat, they suffer from some of the same issues that domestic banks do, in the sense of high house prices, high household debt, and well, in their case, actually lifting interest rates. But they do have steeper yield curves. And then Japanese banks have been the only worst performing or major market in terms of banks, down by about 5% over the past 12 months. So banks have been a significant source of underperformance for our domestic market. Finally, let's just consider the relative valuation of the domestic market. Here we're looking at it on a sector adjusted basis, and we can see that the Australian market is around about a 10% premium, set on a sector adjusted basis to global equity markets. That's in line with its 3-year moving average, and probably very close to its average since about 2005. So it didn't seem to be any sort of outstanding sort of expensive or cheap signals being presented by the domestic market just at the present time.